Tensions are escalating rapidly between China and Taiwan, and the latter is definitely feeling the heat. After weeks of Chinese drills around the Taiwan Strait, the Taiwanese are bulking up their defences, and on Wednesday they conducted military drills both in the air and on the ground. Whilst these drills are an annual event in Taiwan, this year it has an extra layer of importance, as the primary focus was to deter a potential invasion from China, which views Taiwan as a Chinese territory. Taiwan has rejected these claims and has said it will defend itself in the event of an invasion. But whilst it definitely has the military equipment to do so, its military numbers are minimal compared to the Chinese army. So, should Taiwan be able to defend itself, or would it fall within hours? Is it in China's best interest to take Taiwan by force, or will it find a way around it? How will the international community react, especially so close in time to the invasion of Ukraine? Are China and Taiwan heading for an all-out war?
So are China and Taiwan heading for an all-out war? Let's have a 30-second lightning round, gentlemen, before we open up the floor. And David Goldman, if you could please start us off.
That depends on the United States. Since 1972, we've had a one-China policy where both Taiwan and China agree they're the same territory. If China comes to believe that the United States is pressing for sovereignty of Taiwan, then there will be a war, because China will not allow Taiwan to become a sovereign country and not part of China. That's an existential question for the Chinese state.
Right, and Dan Perry, your thoughts on that? An all-out war?
I mean, an all-out war will happen if China decides to launch a war. It's not like Taiwan is going to attack China. And it may be true that China can be compelled to do that by U.S. action or a change in U.S. policy, but I don't see a change in U.S. policy coming. So it really does amount to China deciding whether China wishes to invade Taiwan.
I want to open up the floor by asking an even bigger question, if I may. Is Taiwan militarily capable of actually engaging in a war with China? And Dan Perry, let's go back to you.
Well, China has the largest army in the world with about 2 million active soldiers, and Taiwan is nowhere even close. So obviously, no, Taiwan cannot compete. Taiwan's one advantage is that China would have to basically invade by sea from 100 kilometers away. Its fleet would be exposed. It would be complicated logistically. There is few good landing spots, and in the western bit of Taiwan, where they would land, they would be fired at from tall buildings and attacked from the mountainous core of the island. It would be very, very messy. Of course, a truly emboldened China could bomb Taiwan into submission if they don't care about being a pariah. And I think, a lot of that depends on whether they feel that they can afford such a thing.
David Goldman?
We've had a revolution in military technology in the last few years, as great as the development of the torpedo plane and dive bomber in World War II that wiped out the battleship. China has about 2,000 modern surface-to-air missiles, surface-to-surface missiles, which can destroy American ships, including aircraft carriers. The Aegis and other anti-missile systems we have are 30 years old and completely antiquated. So I think the most likely result of a total sea battle between the United States and Taiwan with American intervention would be the annihilation of the U.S. fleet and the annihilation of American bases in Okinawa and Guam, leading most probably to a nuclear exchange between China and the United States.
Right.
I'm not so sure it's so likely that the U.S. would actually necessarily engage that way. You're giving the U.S. a lot more credit than I think a lot of people do. Will the U.S. really, really fight for Taiwan? I wouldn't be at all surprised if other scenarios would result, including, by the way, if someone like Trump were in power in the U.S., I wouldn't be surprised to see the U.S. do nothing, total acquiescence, whereas under the kind of government we have today. Go ahead.
That's certainly possible, in which case the United States ceases to be a power in the Western Pacific and China becomes the dominant power. Whether the United States would accept that, I do not know. However, for the past 30 years, Taiwan has pretended to arm itself, and China has pretended to be deterred. The Taiwan military has none of the kind of armaments that would be required to successfully delay a Chinese invasion. The United States has proposed to stock it up with surface-to-surface missiles, the so-called porcupine strategy. Mm-hmm. The danger, of course, is that if you were to seriously rearm Taiwan, China might decide to preemptively act. If no one does anything, if there's no change in the one China policy and no fundamental change in Taiwanese armaments, then I think all sides will agree to kick the can down the road and let the one China policy remain in place.
I could be wrong about this, but my sense is, and maybe in a true expert community, the feeling is different. My sense is there is a notion that China, perhaps emboldened by what's happening in Ukraine, or in any case, being more aggressive in the last 5 to 10 years under Xi, might change its position vis-a-vis Taiwan, even if there's no change in U.S. policy. And I guess jumping ahead, I would suggest that the most likely U.S. response would be either inaction in a Trump-like context or some kind of economic warfare with China. I mean, this apocalyptic scenario that you're talking about here of direct U.S.-China fighting that will, A, you're right, probably lead to a U.S. defeat, in the arena itself, and B, potentially embroil everyone in nuclear confrontation is, it's almost too horrifying to contemplate, frankly.
Right, and gentlemen, if I may, it seems like there's almost a bigger picture at play here. We're talking about an American response, how China and Taiwan's militaries will sort of interact here. But it's always been the big question of the Taiwan issue. Is it a sovereign state, or is it actually a renegade and breakaway province of China?
Remember that China is not a nation state, it's an empire. And the majority of great Chinese dynasties that have fallen have done so because a renegade province allied with a foreign power against the center in Beijing. That's the nightmare of any regime in Beijing, and that's why China, the Communist Party of China, has an existential interest in preserving the territorial integrity of China. It's not simply that they don't want a little democracy on their border or that they're naturally rapacious. They believe this would threaten the political stability and integrity of China, given China's history. I think that's deeply underappreciated by Western and particularly American observers.
Right, and I just want to bring Tommy Steiner into the conversation, who has just joined us in our Tel Aviv studios. Tommy Steiner, welcome to the debate.
Thank you.
The question that I was just asking was sort of the bigger picture, and I'd like to get your take on it, whether China actually has a rightful claim to what it calls a breakaway province of Taiwan, or if it's in fact a sovereign nation.
Well, I think that's a really philosophical question. I don't think it's really material at this point. After 70 years, there is a certain status quo. And most of the world does recognize has a one China policy, if not recognizes the one China principle, which are two different things. At least, well, not according to the Chinese, perhaps. But basically, I think the whole point of the normative or legal question of who's right and who's wrong is at this point really mute.
Well, I have to say, borders move around all the time in the world, usually as a function of force. And it's impossible to say what really belongs to who. China has a certain claim to Taiwan because it's a bunch of islands close by to the Chinese coast, and it's an enormous empire. I get that, and they have their quibbles about the rights of empire and their potentially paranoid feelings about what's going to make them unstable. But at the end of the day, it looks like two different countries to me. They have two completely different territorial entities. They have the people are slightly different. There's an indigenous proportion of the people in Taiwan, and histories are different. Taiwan at different times was ruled by the Japanese, by various colonial powers, sure, by waves of Chinese invaders as well. And mainly they have two radically different government systems and people in Taiwan who manifestly want no part of mainland China. You have this complication that Taiwan itself doesn't really declare independence because they feel like they're representing all of China. And therefore, the one China policy is something that awkwardly can be clung to by the various global powers, all of whom kind of wish this goes away and are trying to offend neither side. But realistically, Taiwan is distinct from China at present. And if China wanted to invade it, that would be a pretty big global cataclysm.
That's the Western sovereignty approach, the Westphalian view of how to look at a state. It's not the Chinese imperial view. And the problem is that there's such a disconnect between what China considers to be its existential interest and what Westerners tend to think of as the basis for states, that this misunderstanding could get a great many of us killed. Now, the good news here is that Taiwan has the lowest birth rate of any country in the world except South Korea, and at its current birth rate, it will lose 60% of its population in the course of the present century, and every worker will be supporting every 100 workers will be supporting 130 retirees. So demographically, Taiwan will disappear starting about mid-century. It will only survive on the basis of immigrants from the mainland. And if we simply kick the can down the road and keep up the fiction of a one-China policy, the problem will literally wither away. So that's the best.
Are you suggesting, for lack of a labor force, the Taiwanese will go hat in hand to mainland China and ask to become part of a communist dictatorship?
2 million Taiwanese out of a population of 24 work on the mainland right now. There's $200 billion Taiwanese investment in China. The economic and social ties between Taiwan and the mainland are enormous. And yes, for lack of population, Taiwan will reunify with the mainland, just as North Korea will reunify with South Korea, because their population's declining even faster.
David, I
appreciate those.
Gentlemen, I'd like to give Tommy Steiner the floor for a second.
I have two comments quickly on what David said. I appreciate those projections, but I'd be very, very careful about them because, it's like we say that we all have plans and then God laughs. I don't know what will happen in 60 years. In the span of 60, 70 years, many shifts can happen. And to try and speculate right now, I think it's a bit early. The trends are there, you're right. But on a second point, which I think is even more important, David, you mentioned that the notions of sovereignty are Western and stem from the Westphalian system. That's all true. The only thing is that China is the number one, unless it comes to Ukraine.
Tommy, I'm sorry to interrupt your train of thought there, but we do have to take a quick break. When we get back, we'll have a look a little bit more at American intervention in the Taiwan and China triangle. Welcome back, and thanks for staying with us. Before we reconvene the summit, I want to reintroduce our guests that are with us. Tommy Steiner and Dan Perry in Tel Aviv and David Goldman in New York. Thank you, gentlemen, again for being on the summit. And it's no secret that Taiwan obviously has a threat to its west. It's been conducting live fire drills as well as night drills recently in order to prepare to retaliate, as they say, for a Chinese attack. Let's take a listen.
Ground combat and readiness training is essential duty of the armed forces and is also something we have to do every day and every moment. Regarding defense operations in Taiwan and its outlying islands, we conduct our exercises with the attitude of reacting to threats according to terrain and being able to fight everywhere to complete our duty of increasing war preparedness. This is the most basic attitude of all our officers and soldiers. Taiwan's armed forces are closely monitoring all military developments worldwide, including the war in Ukraine, and are studying them in great detail. At the same time, according to the orders of the Minister of Defense, we are taking on board criticism and suggestions from all sides. We will study those no matter if they come from think tanks or departments of our armed forces.
Military developments worldwide, of course, the biggest, I should say, war that comes to mind in terms of a military invasion right now is Russia's invasion in Ukraine. The big question really is here, is China watching this closely and possibly looking to imitate it in Taiwan? Gentlemen, another 30-second lightning round, and I'd like to give the floor first to Dan Perry.
Well, I think China, as my colleagues say, finds itself above the Westphalian system even, which forms the organizing principle of the rest of the globe, may feel it's above taking a cue from Putin. But I have to think China's leaders are looking very closely to see if Putin can walk away from his Ukraine misadventure with the sense of having gotten away with something. And if the answer is yes, then that may embolden them even further vis-a-vis Taiwan.
David Goldman?
Taiwan's military is something of a pantomime. Israelis will appreciate that the Taiwanese have exactly 4 months of military service, and they can't recruit fighter pilots to fly the planes they currently have or are buying for the United States. So I think it's an entirely different situation. In the broad sense, if the Ukraine war weakens the power of the United States and fractures the Western alliance, it may encourage the Chinese to be more aggressive. But I don't believe that these are really comparable situations. I don't think Beijing sees it that way at all.
And last but certainly not least, Tommy Steiner, do you agree here?
Yes and no. First of all, there's one thing we have to understand. The Chinese always study other nations' experiences. So if the question is if they're studying it, oh, definitely. I'm not sure to what extent this, we can draw one from one to the other. But the Americans think to a certain extent that yes, therefore so will the Chinese.
Absolutely. It's definitely a matter of yes and no here. And I'd like, if I could, to play devil's advocate. The United States has domestic issues to worry about. It's also got foreign policy issues in terms of Ukraine as well as Iran to deal with. Is Taiwan really on the top of the agenda for the Americans?
Well, remember, as has been suggested, Taiwan dominates the global microchip market. That's a major thing that cannot be ignored. And also, Taiwan is, although it's nowhere near a large military, it is, of course, like somewhere around number 20 economy in the world, and it also is a major trading partner of the U.S. So it's not a non-issue. But I think the main matter on the table here, of course, is the matter of Taiwan relates to the danger of a more major conflagration with China, and that's what America is really worried about, and that's why they would like to freeze frame the whole situation and have it go away. And of course, as has also been said, if America should end up looking like it abandoned Taiwan too egregiously, then that would damage America's standing in the world, and that, of course, is completely unacceptable to Washington.
I agree that the United States would be very reluctant to allow Taiwan to go down without a fight. It's important to remember that the Nancy Pelosi visit to Taiwan this summer is the cause of the present crisis. She's the number 3 official constitutionally of the United States, second in line to the president. So a visit by an official of that rank comes close to diplomatic recognition and calls into question American strategic ambiguity and American commitment to the one China policy. If the United States gave very clear signals that it was sticking to the one China policy and would not support Taiwanese sovereignty, I think the Chinese would show strategic patience and we'd kick the crisis down the road, which is probably the best thing we could do with them.
Do you think they're right in having seen Pelosi as almost an extension of the Biden administration, in effect, as if she was a high-ranking official and this was a signal that should be taken to mean something?
Absolutely. That if you read the Chinese, not just the Chinese press, but Chinese political websites, that's exactly how it's interpreted. The Chinese are extremely legalistic in the way they view these things.
And I know they interpret it that way. I'm saying, can't they be?
Debbie, you're forgetting that this is not the first time that a speaker has visited Taiwan. It has happened before.
Yes, but that was 20 years ago. It was in a very different world.
That's true, but still, it's not the first time in terms of presidents. But more importantly,
or misinterpret something doesn't mean they can't be disabused. Is all I'm saying.
Yeah, but look, the thing is. It was very clear in this crisis that the Chinese were preparing for this crisis, and they had really military plans ready and set to go, in which they wanted to move very close to the encirclement of Taiwan militarily. So I'm not sure, to what extent, we can all pin this on Speaker Pelosi, pin all the crisis on her. There's a certain context to the crisis. Yes, she aggravated the situation. Was it smart? Probably not. It's not the question. But most of the plans, most of the emotions were already set and go and ready to move. Let's not forget that either. That is not, however, to say that the United States is not upholding strategic ambiguity. And if I was to listen to President Biden more than once, he was coming very close to the point of breaking the strategic ambiguity. And, I think that Taiwan matters more to the United States than Ukraine does. Or in other words, when it comes to Ukraine, the Americans expect that the Europeans will also chip in. When it comes to Taiwan, there's nobody else. And the US has a certain obligation, a legal obligation, of course, to defend or to help and support Taiwanese defense.
Tommy, if I may challenge you there, yes. you made reference to the fact that Taiwan is probably a bigger concern and policy issue for the United States than Ukraine. Only 14 nations around the world, most of them islands, actually recognize Taiwan's sovereignty. But a whole bunch of them have turned around outside of those that recognize it to say that in the event that China attacks, it will come to its defense because it's a democracy. Is that what this is all about, democracy?
Once again, no. Nobody said that they'll come to their defense.
Tommy, what legal obligation? Name me the treaty, the legislation.
Oh, no. Defense. The US defense.
That legal obligation resigned.
Well, I was referring to the U.S. law, the Taiwan Defense Act. Nothing more, not an international obligation, a legal internal obligation.
There is no legal obligation on the part of the United States to defend Taiwan.
No, but there's an internal legislation in the United States, if I'm not mistaken.
But there's a political commitment.
Might not decide to do it. There's a political impulse to do it, but there is no legal obligation.
There's a political
no. Then let me clarify what I meant. Sorry, I understand where you're going with this, David, but that's not what I meant.
Gentlemen, it's evident that there's a lot of passion here around a very controversial topic, but we are unfortunately out of time. So once again, I'd like to thank our fantastic panelists, Tommy Steiner, David Goldman, and Dan Perry. Stay tuned. We'll have more on Global Eye in a bit.